The cost of buying a car has been accelerating big time.
Another shortage blamed on the pandemic. It involves your car.
Second-hand prices have actually gone up
56% higher since the start of the pandemic.
Earlier this week, I went onto Reddit to ask the people what they thought was the most overpriced cars in the market today. As you would expect, there were the usual suspects such as pickup trucks, luxury EVs, Nissan Skyline GTRs and Supras of course. But one car stood out on top of all of them as possibly the most overpriced car today. All of them. For this video we are going to investigate what the hell happened to the car market. Now we all know well how crazy the car prices have gotten, but not a lot of people seem to know why. They just put it down to inflation, which is understandable but inaccurate. The truth is, it goes down to a few factors: the pandemic, computer chips, demand and greed. We first start off with the pandemic. In early 2020, COVID-19 took over the world, causing the earth to basically stand still. Shops, bars and factories were closed, sporting events were cancelled, and most unfortunately, people lost their lives. As for factories, most of them were shut down. But as for the ones that stayed open, they were forced to work under very strict, low volume of workers, which meant that car production slowed right down. Meanwhile, people were being made to work from home as well. So their cars were made almost redundant. So changing them just seemed silly. And so car purchases were down. On top of all that, people discovered that they weren't running their cars as often as they used to. And so they ended up saving money on fuel, insurance and vehicle inspections because all the test centres were closed because of the pandemic. So as the world stopped, the car world stopped too. Enough about the pandemic, we're now going to move on to computer chips. As automakers weren't making as many cars as they used to, they decided that they didn't really need as many computer chips as they used to. So rather than buy the same amount as they used to, they usually just bought a limited supply of them, and the remaining chips were then sold to other companies in other industries. Unfortunately, when the restrictions were lifted and automakers were allowed to make more cars again, they didn't have the chips they needed. And so, no chips, no cars. Each car has about 3,000 chips in them, and EVs and hybrids have even more. So what this caused was delays of certain models and limited spots for buyers to order said cars. Automakers were unable to sell certain makes and models. That's how bad things had gotten at one stage. And to top it all off, this whole fiasco for computer chips only created a global chip shortage. Although we're through most of it, we're still facing the repercussions of it. Which brings me on to my next point, demand. As automakers weren't pushing out cars fast enough, car buyers were either torn between either being patient and waiting for a new car, while potentially having to pay a premium on top of that, or buying something second hand. With this in mind, several buyers decided to either save money or buy a second hand car instead, as they were available right away. They're also better for the environment as well, because they're technically recycling. Meanwhile, new drivers were also out of a job during the pandemic, but they were given government payments on a weekly basis to make up for them missing out. But these payments were usually more than what they would have gotten on a weekend of work. And so, young drivers had plenty of money to buy a new car. So what you now have is new car buyers that were snubbed to buying a new car, as well as young drivers who were either learning to drive or buying their first car. And so, the used car market shot up massively, causing, you guessed it, a used car shortage. As a result, people are having to pay more for less. In fact, it's so bad that if you bought a car maybe in the last 2 or 3 years, you likely may be able to sell it for what you paid for it. Which of course is the car world's double-edged sword. Which means you get more money for the car you sold, but you have to pay more money for the car you bought. Now this brings me on to my final point. Greed. A lot of the manufacturers post-COVID had changed the way that they produced cars. In the past, they would have made several different makes and models and handed them out to their dealerships as demonstrations. And these cars would eventually have been sold as second-hand vehicles once their demonstration days were over. What you ended up with was more cars than you technically needed. So what they decided to do was what I like to call the Ferrari approach. No, they didn't do a bad race strategy. Instead, what they did was copy their business plan. What Ferrari do is probably one of the most successful, if not scummiest business plans out there. Let's say 4,000 people are interested in buying a car. Ferrari will only make 2,000 of them for the following year, so whoever really wants them has to pay a premium to get them. Otherwise, you're going to have to be put on a 2-year waiting list or so. As a result, other automakers looked at this and went, "That's genius, Ferrari. I'm going to do the same." And so, we ended up with fewer cars being available, being sold for well above their asking price, or their MSRP. So what is the result of all of this? Well, obviously, I cannot speak for every country in the world, but in Ireland, car prices are up 64% compared to pre-pandemic. Used car prices are also up 29%, making affordable cars not affordable anymore. This hasn't just affected your normal cars though, but it's affected the classics as well, like the Nissan Skyline R34 GTR, which nowadays is a 150 to 200,000 euro car right now, and in my brutally honest opinion, it's barely worth 50. That's right, anything over 50 grand for a 20-year-old Nissan, Mitsubishi or Toyota is just blasphemous in my opinion. So the term cheap and cheerful appears to have gone missing somewhere, and it appears it may likely never come back. With an apparent recession looming, it appears that the prices will surely take a hit once people stop spending money. And maybe, just maybe, car prices will go back to a form of normal. So have I any car buying advice for any of my viewers? Well, if you're in the market for a new car and you don't necessarily need it, then don't buy it. There. Thank you for watching.